Let's get started. Story number 1.
The rain had been coming down in torrents all evening. The sound of it pattering against the windows had been a steady background to the quiet of the house. I loved it. There was something comforting about the rhythmic sound, the way it seemed to drown out everything else. The wind had picked up as well, sending gusts of air howling against the house, making the old walls creak and groan. It was just me, alone in the house that night. My parents had left on a trip, and my older brother was away at college. I was used to the quiet by now. Growing up in a big old house on the edge of town had meant I was often left to my own devices, especially on nights like this. A little rain, a little wind, it didn't bother me. It was almost soothing, like the house was safe and protected from the storm outside. I had settled in on the couch with a cup of tea, the TV on low, and a book in my lap. It was a normal evening, one I had looked forward to after a long day of work. The house was warm and inviting, the soft glow of the lamp casting a cozy light across the living room. I felt completely at ease, even though I was by myself. I had been reading for a while when I heard the knock. It was soft at first, almost like the wind. But then it came again, more distinct this time. I froze, the book forgotten in my lap. The knocking was coming from the front door, and it was loud enough that I could hear it even over the sound of the storm outside. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 10:30 p.m. Who would be at the door this late on a rainy night? I wasn't expecting anyone. No friends, no family, no deliveries. The thought of opening the door to a stranger made my skin crawl. I stood up slowly, cautiously, and moved toward the hallway. The knocking came again, more urgent now. I reached the door and hesitated. I could see nothing through the peephole, just the dark, rainy night outside. My heart was beating a little faster now. I had always been cautious, especially when I was home alone. But something about the timing, the sound of the knock, and the eerie stillness of the night set me on edge. "Hello?" I called out through the door, trying to sound calm. I hoped it was just a neighbor or someone in need of help. The last thing I wanted to do was be rude, but my gut told me something was off. There was no reply. Just silence. I stood there, my hand still resting on the doorknob, debating what to do. I didn't want to open the door to a stranger, but I also didn't want to be rude if it was someone who needed help. I slowly backed away from the door, moving toward the living room where my phone sat on the coffee table. Maybe I could call someone, just to be safe. The moment I turned away from the door, I heard it again. The sound of the doorknob rattling. My breath caught in my throat and my body froze in place. Someone was trying to open the door. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. My heart was pounding now, and my thoughts were racing. Who was at the door? Why were they trying to get in? The phone rang, and I could hear the dispatcher answer on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone outside my house, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. They're knocking on the door, and now they're trying to open it. I'm home alone. I'm scared. Stay calm, ma'am, the dispatcher said in a reassuring voice. Do you know who it is? I don't know, I replied, my voice trembling. I don't recognize the knock. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and don't open the door. Police are on their way. Can you tell me your address? I quickly gave her my address, my mind racing. I had always been careful about locking the doors, but in my rush to get comfortable earlier, I hadn't double-checked everything. Now, as the seconds ticked by, I realized how vulnerable I was. The dispatcher continued to speak calmly, asking me to stay on the line and keep my phone in hand. I could hear her typing in the background, likely dispatching officers to my location. I looked back at the front door, and I swear I could hear the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. Was someone walking around outside? My mind raced with possibilities. My eyes darted toward the windows, but I couldn't see anything through the rain-smeared glass. I'm scared, I whispered into the phone. Stay on the line, the dispatcher repeated. The officers will be there soon. Just stay calm. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, just half expecting someone to appear in the doorway. My nerves were on edge. The wind howled outside, and the sound of rain beating against the windows seemed to grow louder, drowning out all other noises. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so unsettled. A few more minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. Then, just as I was beginning to think the police were never going to show up, I heard a loud thud against the door. I gasped, the noise echoing in the otherwise quiet house. It sounded like someone had kicked the door. I quickly backed away, moving to the kitchen and grabbing a heavy flashlight. I wasn't sure what good it would do if someone had already broken in, but I wasn't going to just sit there and wait. The rattling of the doorknob resumed, louder this time, followed by another thud. My heart raced, and I was barely holding it together. I tried to steady my breathing as I crept through the house, looking for any other exits or possible places to hide. The wind howled, and I could hear the creaking of the house as it settled. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. It felt like the storm was closing in on me, and the knocking at the door was only making it worse. I tried to push my thoughts away, but fear crept into my mind. What if they were already inside? What if they had somehow gotten past the door? Suddenly, I heard a soft voice calling from the front yard. It was barely audible over the wind, but I could hear it clearly enough to recognize that it was not coming from outside the door. It was coming from the porch just below the window. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was soft and almost pleading, but there was something strange about it, something off. I stood motionless, my heart racing. This didn't make sense. Who would be outside in the rain, asking for help in the middle of the night? Something about it felt wrong, like a trap. I didn't respond. I just stood there, my hand clutching the flashlight, waiting. The voice continued, softer now, as if the person had moved farther away. "Please, let me in. I'm scared. I need help." I shuddered, feeling a chill run down my spine. I knew I couldn't let anyone in. Not with the door rattling like that. Not with the police still on their way. But the feeling of being watched, of being trapped, was overwhelming. I needed to do something. I grabbed my phone again, ready to call the police a second time, when I heard a new sound. A faint but distinct sound of something scraping against the window. My eyes shot toward the kitchen window, and I was paralyzed with fear. Someone was outside, moving around the house. I could hear the sound of footsteps in the rain, slow and deliberate. I quickly ducked behind the kitchen island, trying to stay out of sight. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I jumped. It was a message from my brother. "Hey, I'm coming home early. How are you doing? Is everything all right?" The message didn't help. I didn't have time to reply. The sound outside grew louder. There was a distinct shuffle now, a dragging sound, as if someone was walking along the side of the house. I didn't know what to do. I was panicking. The police were still on their way, but it felt like an eternity. I thought I heard the front door creak again. My eyes darted back to the front room, and I saw the shadow of a figure moving past the window. I couldn't take it anymore. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and I screamed, rushing toward the back door. But as I turned to make my escape, I saw the flashing lights outside. The police had arrived. I collapsed to the floor in relief as the officers rushed in, their flashlights scanning the house. They checked every room, clearing the house, and finally they came back to me. "There's no sign of anyone in the house, ma'am," one of the officers said. "We've searched the perimeter." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what had happened. The knocking, the scraping, the strange voice. It all seemed like some kind of nightmare. But as I looked around at the officers, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The storm had been brewing for hours, a steady crescendo of wind and rain hammering against the windows of Sarah's small, 2-story home. The world outside was a blur of shifting shadows and splattering water, the lights from the street lamps barely cutting through the downpour. It was one of those rare nights when the sound of the storm felt more like a living entity, pressing in from all sides. Sarah had always liked the sound of rain, but tonight it felt different, almost oppressive. She had just turned 17, a milestone she celebrated quietly by staying home alone. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, visiting friends in a neighboring town. They'd left her with the usual reminders: don't invite anyone over, lock the doors, and stay safe. Sarah was used to being home alone, but the isolation felt more pronounced tonight. There was something about the storm, the howling wind, and the occasional flicker of the power that left her feeling unsettled. The house itself was old, built in the late 1800s, with creaky floors and doors that never quite shut all the way. It was the kind of house that seemed to have a personality, one that whispered and groaned as the wind pushed through the cracks in the windows. It wasn't the kind of house that made you feel safe, but it was her home, and she'd always felt a sense of comfort there. Tonight, though, the air felt heavy. Every creak, every groan of the house felt like a warning. Sarah had been reading on the couch, a book she had borrowed from the library. The pages felt damp in her hands, a side effect of the humidity creeping in through the old windows. She had the fireplace on, a weak but comforting heat that barely cut through the chill of the evening. She heard the occasional car pass by on the road, but they were few and far between, and the ones that did pass had their headlights blurred by the rain. She hadn't heard from her parents in a while, and though they had texted earlier to say they were having a good time, Sarah couldn't help but feel a bit lonely. The clock on the wall ticked past 8, and she decided it was time to call it a night. She set her book down and reached for the remote to turn off the TV, which had been playing quietly in the background. As she did, she heard something, a faint noise from downstairs. It was subtle at first, just a scraping sound. Her brow furrowed, and she paused, listening intently. The house was old, and sometimes the wind could make it sound like something was moving around inside. But this sound was different. It was a sharp, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. Sarah's heart rate quickened, and she tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up her spine. Maybe it was the wind again, or maybe something had fallen off the shelf. But something in her gut told her to check it out. Slowly, she stood up and crept toward the stairs. The house was dark, except for the dim glow of the fire and a few lights in the kitchen. As she reached the top of the stairs, she paused and listened again. The sound had stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm outside. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table and texted her mom, "Everything okay?" Her mom's reply came almost immediately. "All good here. We're at the restaurant. You're safe?" "Yeah, just hearing things," Sarah typed back. "Storm is loud." But even as she sent the message, she wasn't convinced. The house wasn't the same when it was quiet. The faintest noise, the smallest movement, felt amplified. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot as she walked down the hallway, and the wind howled outside. The longer she stayed in the house, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She reached the top of the stairs and glanced down into the dark hallway. Her bedroom door was open, and from where she stood, she could just make out the faint outlines of her bed, the desk, and the window beyond. Everything looked normal, but she couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone. Another sound, this time louder, came from downstairs. A thud, a soft, muffled thud that made her freeze in place. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to dismiss it as nothing, as the house settling or an old pipe, but she couldn't. Something was wrong. She glanced back down the hallway toward the stairs. She wasn't sure if she should go down and check it out. What if someone had broken in? She thought about calling her parents again, but the signal was weak and her hands were shaking too much to type anything coherent. It seemed ridiculous. Who would be here? The house was far from the main road, isolated on a small plot of land surrounded by trees. The neighbors were too far away to be of help, even if they did hear anything. As she stood frozen, the thud came again, louder this time. It was definitely coming from downstairs. Sarah had never been so sure of anything in her life. Someone was in the house. She turned quickly and ran toward her bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She stood in the corner, trying to control her breathing. There was no phone in her room. She had to make it downstairs. She had to call the police. Her mind raced as she scanned the room. She glanced at the window. If she could break it, she could climb out and run to the neighbors. But there was no time. She couldn't risk being spotted. Her only choice was to stay hidden. She heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate this time. They were coming up the stairs. "Sarah," a voice whispered from the hallway, low and almost familiar. "It's me." She froze. The voice sounded like her father's, but it couldn't be him. He was hours away, and he'd told her they wouldn't be home until after midnight. But the voice, it had that same rasp to it, the same timbre she knew so well. "Sarah, open the door," the voice pleaded, softer now. The door to her bedroom creaked. She held her breath, gripping the edge of the dresser as if it could protect her from whatever was outside. She didn't move, not even when the voice called out again, this time almost a whisper, but the words clear enough to send chills down her spine. "I'm here to help you." Her heart beat faster, her palms slick with sweat. This wasn't her father's voice. It couldn't be. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and for a long moment there was silence. Then the doorknob rattled. "Sarah," the voice came again, now tinged with impatience. "I know you're in there. Open the door. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't know what to do. She didn't know whether to stay quiet or call for help, but she knew she couldn't open that door. Not now. Not when something felt so terribly off. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to stay silent. Then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had appeared, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The storm outside roared louder than before, but inside, the house was unnervingly still. Sarah couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement, just the heavy silence. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Sarah didn't know. She was too afraid to move. Finally, she pulled herself together, grabbed her phone, and tried to dial 911. The screen was blank. The battery had died. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain had been falling relentlessly all evening, tapping against the windows like a constant whisper that wouldn't let up. It had started in the late afternoon, a gentle drizzle that turned into a torrential downpour as the night wore on. By the time the clock struck 9 p.m., the streets outside were completely deserted, and the wind howled as it whipped through the trees, bending them at odd angles. Lena sat in the living room of her small 2-bedroom house, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the storm rage outside. She had lived alone for the last 3 years, ever since her last roommate had moved out, and though she was used to the solitude, nights like this always made her feel a little uneasy. The house creaked under the weight of the wind, and the thunder made the entire room vibrate every time it cracked across the sky. She glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls, just the comforting hum of the stillness. Her parents lived an hour away, and though they had invited her over for dinner that evening, Lena had opted to stay home. She liked the quiet. She liked being able to control the space she occupied. Tonight, however, the storm felt too loud, too persistent. There was a sudden knock on the door. Lena's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the kind of knock you expect on a rainy night like this. The door was solid oak, and the knock wasn't faint, but insistent, as if someone was standing just outside, waiting. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She didn't expect anyone. No one visited her this late, especially not in a storm like this. But then the knock came again, louder this time. A firm, demanding sound. Who could it be? She stood up, wrapping the blanket around her tighter, and made her way slowly to the door. She peered through the peephole, but all she could see was the torrential rain. No figure, no silhouette, just the blurry outline of the porch light casting a dim, hazy glow. Her heart was racing now, but curiosity got the better of her. She unlocked the door and cracked it open just a sliver, enough to see if anyone was standing there. A man's voice came from the darkness. "Excuse me, miss. I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car broke down just a mile up the road. I've been walking for a while and He stopped abruptly, as if unsure of how to continue. Lena hesitated. She didn't recognize the man, and his voice sounded strained, as though he was cold or in distress. The idea of letting a stranger into her home didn't sit well with her, but something about the desperation in his voice made her want to help. I'm really sorry to ask this," the man continued. "But would you mind letting me use your phone to call for a tow? My battery's dead, and there's no way I can make it anywhere else tonight." Lena glanced over her shoulder toward the warm glow of her living room. The storm outside was violent, and the last thing she wanted was to send someone back into that nightmare of wind and rain. Still, her instinct told her to be careful. She opened the door just a little wider, enough to see his face. He looked tired, drenched, and his clothes were soaked through, but he didn't look dangerous. She could see the outline of his car parked a few houses down, headlights dim in the downpour. I guess you can use my phone, Lena said, her voice uncertain but kind. But just for a call, okay? The man smiled, relief flashing across his features. Thank you so much. I promise I won't be long. Lena stepped aside to let him in, her mind still racing with questions she couldn't answer. She closed the door behind him, locking it again for safety. The man, drenched and shivering, walked past her into the living room and sat on the couch, shaking his head as if trying to shake off the cold. Do you want some dry clothes or a drink? Lena offered, though she immediately regretted it. Offering him anything felt too intimate, too much. But he was still drenched, and it didn't seem right to just leave him sitting there in her living room. He smiled again, but there was something about it that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'd appreciate it if you have some coffee or tea. Anything hot. Lena nodded, still feeling unsure, but walked into the kitchen to brew some coffee. The storm outside rattled the windows, and the wind gusted fiercely against the house. It was so loud that she could barely hear the man moving around in the living room. As she waited for the coffee to brew, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the storm or the man's sudden arrival. It was the strange unease that clung to her every thought. Maybe she was overthinking it. She had let strangers into her home before when her friends came by, after all. But something didn't sit right. The kettle clicked off, signaling that the coffee was ready. She grabbed 2 mugs and returned to the living room, setting them down on the coffee table in front of the man. He was sitting quietly, staring into the fireplace, his hands folded in his lap. Thank you, he said as she handed him one of the mugs. His fingers brushed hers, but the touch was cold. You're welcome. Lena sat down across from him, her mind still racing. She tried to think of something to say, something to make the situation feel less awkward, but the silence between them stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Do you need to make your call now? She asked, hoping to break the tension. Oh, right, he said, his voice returning to that strained tone. I'll just be a minute. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out an old, cracked phone, and began dialing. His eyes were fixed on the screen as he typed the numbers. Lena couldn't help but notice that his hands were shaking. It was unnerving. The call seemed to go on forever. Lena glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been nearly 10 minutes. Was he still talking to the tow truck service? She couldn't hear any conversation, only the faint clicking sound as he tapped the screen. She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable in the stillness, but before she could say anything, the man abruptly hung up. He turned to her, his eyes dark and unfocused. There's a problem, he said, his voice now hard, cold. I can't get through. The service won't come. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Something in his tone felt wrong. What do you mean? She asked, her voice tight. It's late. I'm sure they're just busy with other calls. No, it's not that, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. They can't come, and you're the only one who can help me now. Lena's blood ran cold. Something about the way he looked at her sent a jolt of panic through her. This was no longer the harmless man she'd let into her house. What do you mean? She asked again, her voice trembling now. He stood up suddenly, his movements fast, too fast. The coffee mug in his hand trembled. I don't need help with my car, he said. I need help with you. Lena's heart thudded in her chest. Before she could react, he lunged toward her. She jumped to her feet, knocking the coffee table over as she scrambled backward, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Stay back, she shouted, her voice rising in panic. Stay away from me. The man hesitated, looking at her for a moment, his eyes wide and wild. You're not going to call anyone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Not unless you want things to get messy. Lena backed into the corner of the room, her mind racing. She had to get away, had to find a way out of this. Her phone was on the couch, within reach, but she couldn't make it to it without getting closer to him. Her mind scrambled for a plan, but she couldn't think straight. The man took a step toward her, and then, in the distance, she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. The man froze, his eyes darting to the window. For the briefest moment, Lena thought he might leave, that he might run. But then the storm raged on, and he took a step forward, his voice low and cold. You should have just helped me, Lena. Now it's too late. But before he could get any closer, the door slammed open with a violent crash. In the doorway stood two police officers, guns drawn. "Freeze! Police!" one of them shouted. Lena felt her legs give way, and she collapsed into the corner of the room, her body shaking with the adrenaline rush. The man's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't move, and in an instant, the officers had him in handcuffs. Lena couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, as the officers took control of the situation. The relief was overwhelming, but it didn't take away the terror she had just experienced. Once the situation was under control, one of the officers turned to her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, still shaken. "I think so," she whispered. The storm outside raged on, but for Lena, the night was finally over. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was past midnight when the rain started. At first, it was a light drizzle, just enough to make the windows fog up. But within minutes, the sky opened, and sheets of rain pounded against the roof and windows, creating a dull, constant drumming sound. I was alone in the house, something that rarely happened. My parents had gone to visit my grandmother in another town, and my older brother was away at college. I had begged my mom to let me stay home, not wanting to spend the weekend in a place with no Wi-Fi, and after much convincing, she finally agreed. The house wasn't particularly big, but on a night like this, it felt cavernous. The living room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. I had been watching a movie, but the sound of heavy raindrops had distracted me. I reached for my phone and checked the time, 12:43 a.m. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and for a moment, the power flickered. I tensed, waiting to see if the lights would go out completely. They didn't, but the sudden change in brightness made my heart skip a beat. I shook my head, laughing at myself. "Get a grip," I muttered, reaching for the remote to turn off the TV. I stood up and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my legs from sitting too long. The house was eerily quiet aside from the rain. I walked toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. The floor creaked under my feet, a sound I had heard 1,000 times before, but in the silence it felt unnerving. As I poured my water, I noticed something odd, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The front door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it. My mom had reminded me before she left, and I had double-checked it before settling in for the night. But now the deadbolt was turned, the door slightly ajar. A cold chill ran through me. I set the glass down slowly, my hands suddenly clammy. Had I forgotten? No, that was impossible. I never forgot to lock the door when I was alone. I took a hesitant step forward, reaching out to push the door shut. The moment my fingers touched the wood, a loud crack of thunder boomed, shaking the windows. I jumped, heart hammering in my chest. I quickly locked the door, double-checking it this time, then turned around, scanning the dimly lit living room. Nothing seemed out of place, but something felt off. The air was heavy, like someone else was there. I listened carefully, but all I could hear was the rain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Trying to calm myself, I reasoned that maybe the wind had pushed the door open. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly when I came in earlier. That made sense, right? But then I noticed something else. One of the dining room chairs was slightly pulled out. I was sure I hadn't been in the dining room since dinner, and I always pushed my chair in. Slowly, I backed away, my breathing becoming shallow. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from upstairs. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't imagining things. Someone was in the house. I felt frozen, unable to move as fear gripped me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police, run outside? But outside was a torrential downpour, and if someone really was upstairs, they could be blocking the only exit. I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. I quickly dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear. Nothing. No ringing, no dial tone. I pulled the phone away and looked at the screen. No service. The storm must have knocked out the signal. My stomach twisted in fear. Another sound. This time it was the faintest sound of a door creaking open. Upstairs, I had to move. I turned off the living room lamp, plunging the room into darkness. My heart pounded as I crept toward the hallway, my socks making no noise against the wooden floor. I peeked around the corner, staring at the staircase. It was too dark to see anything, but I swore I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Just barely audible over the rain. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. If I ran, whoever was up there would hear me. Instead, I crouched down, moving slowly toward the kitchen. I needed something, anything I could use to defend myself. My fingers wrapped around a kitchen knife, gripping it tightly. My breath was shallow, my entire body trembling. Then the worst thing happened. A single, deliberate footstep echoed from the top of the stairs. Then another. They were coming down. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could see the silhouette now, a shadowy figure descending the stairs. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they knew I was watching. I clenched the knife tighter, my knuckles white. The figure reached the bottom step, stopping in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to move. Then, lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a split second. And in that moment, I saw him. A man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. He was looking right at me. My breath hitched. Then, without warning, he lunged. I reacted instinctively, swinging the knife wildly. He was faster than I expected. He dodged, grabbing for my wrist. I yanked away, stumbling backwards, slamming into the counter. The knife slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. I had no choice. I ran. I bolted for the back door, fumbling with the lock. Behind me, I heard him moving fast. My fingers finally found the latch, and I yanked the door open, rain pouring in as I stumbled outside. I ran, the cold rain soaking me instantly. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Somehow, I made it to my neighbor's house, pounding on their door, screaming for help. Lights flickered on, and within moments, Mr. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, opened the door, eyes wide with confusion. "There's someone in my house!" I gasped, shivering, drenched from head to toe. He didn't hesitate. He pulled me inside and grabbed his phone, calling the police. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, trembling, waiting for help to arrive. When the police finally showed up, they searched my house thoroughly, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints inside, no one. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. The police assured me I was safe, but I knew the truth. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching me. And the worst part, the front door was unlocked again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The rain had been falling steadily since the early afternoon. By the time evening came, it had turned into a heavy downpour, the kind that made the world outside seem distant and muffled. The streets were empty, the only sound the occasional crack of thunder, followed by the low hum of the wind. From where I sat, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm as I listened to the storm outside. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and my older brother was away at college. So I was alone, something I was used to by now. I had the house to myself for a few days, and I was looking forward to the solitude. After a long week of work and school, I relished the idea of having the entire place to myself. I'd made dinner for one, just some pasta and a salad, and then settled down with a book, the television on in the background for a little extra noise. I wasn't scared of being home alone. I had done it countless times before, and the house was quiet, but comforting in its own way. The living room was warm, the soft glow of the lamp on the side table creating a peaceful ambiance. I let my mind drift as the rain pelted against the windows, the trees outside swaying in the wind. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I wasn't tired, but I liked the idea of getting under the covers and watching something on my phone before falling asleep. As I stood up from the couch, I noticed that the wind outside had picked up. It was howling now, and the branches of the trees scraped against the windows. I walked toward the stairs, but just as I was about to ascend, I heard a soft knock at the front door. I froze. The sound seemed out of place in the stillness of the house, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. But no. There it was again, a soft knock followed by a second. I stood there in the hallway, my hand resting on the railing, uncertain of what to do. Who would be at the door at this hour, especially with a storm like this? I moved quietly down the hall, closer to the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. I couldn't see anyone. Just the wet porch, the rain pouring down, and the faint outline of the porch light above the door. I felt a strange sense of unease, something I couldn't quite place. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone who had mistakenly come to the wrong house, but as I stepped back from the door, I heard a rustling sound coming from outside. It sounded like footsteps, but muffled by the rain. My heart began to race. I wasn't someone who's scared easily, but there was something unsettling about being alone, hearing someone knock at your door at night in the middle of a storm. I walked over to the phone on the kitchen counter and grabbed it. My fingers hesitated over the screen. Should I call someone? The police? It felt extreme, but the thought of opening the door to a stranger was terrifying. I couldn't stand there in silence anymore. Slowly, I approached the door again, this time standing off to the side, out of view from anyone who might be on the porch. I held my breath, listening. A soft knock came again. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I didn't open the door. Instead, I turned and ran to the back window, peering out into the dark yard. There, standing in the rain, was a figure. A person, barely visible in the darkness. They were standing just outside the edge of the porch light, facing away from me. My stomach dropped. What were they doing out there? I couldn't make out their features, but I could tell they were just standing there, unmoving. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Was I being paranoid? Was it just some random person lost in the storm? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the figure in the rain. It didn't move, not even when the wind picked up and the rain began to pour harder. Finally, the figure shifted, turning slightly. I quickly ducked away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Had they seen me? Were they coming toward the house? I couldn't wait anymore. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed the police. It rang for what seemed like forever before someone picked up. 911. What's your emergency? There's someone outside my house, I said, my voice tight with fear. I don't know who they are, but they're standing on my porch just staring at the house. I'm home alone, and I'm scared. Stay calm, the dispatcher said, her voice soothing but urgent. Can you confirm your address? I quickly gave her the address, my hands trembling as I held the phone. My eyes kept darting to the window, half expecting to see the figure moving closer. The dispatcher told me that officers would be dispatched immediately and that I should stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and remain on the phone with her until they arrived. I hung up and rushed to the front door, double-checking the locks. I felt safer with the doors secured, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The wind howled outside, making the house feel colder, despite the warmth inside. Every creak and groan of the old house sent my nerves into overdrive. I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the door. It was like someone was trying to open it, just gently, testing the handle. I gripped the handle of the flashlight tightly, not knowing what to expect. A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. I rushed to the window again, peering out just in time to see the flashing lights of the police cars turning into the driveway. Relief washed over me, but the feeling of dread lingered in the pit of my stomach. The officers quickly exited their cars and approached the house. I stayed inside, not daring to open the door. I could hear them outside talking, and I felt a glimmer of hope that help was finally here. The sound of their footsteps on the porch sent my heart fluttering in my chest, and I knew I could relax just a little, knowing they were here. The officer knocked on the door, and I cautiously opened it, feeling a sense of vulnerability as I stepped into the hallway. "We're here to help," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Can you tell us what happened?" I explained the situation to him, my voice shaking slightly as I spoke. I told him about the figure I had seen outside, the strange knocking at the door, and the fear that had built up inside me as the minutes passed. The officer nodded, and another officer joined him on the porch. "We'll take a look around the property," he said. "Stay inside and don't open the door until we say it's safe." I nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. I watched through the window as they circled the house, looking for any signs of someone who might have been there. The rain continued to pour, but the storm felt less ominous now that help had arrived. A few minutes later, the officers came back to the door. "There's no one on the property," the officer said, his expression neutral. "We did a thorough check. You're safe." I exhaled, the tension I had been holding in my chest slowly beginning to release. "Thank you," I whispered, still not entirely sure what had happened. The officers stayed for a few more minutes, asking a few more questions and giving me advice on how to stay safe. After they left, I locked up the house again and returned to the living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. I kept checking the windows, looking out into the storm, half expecting to see the figure again. But the night remained quiet. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling through the trees. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized I hadn't heard anything more from the storm. The rain had stopped, and the air was still. I had made it through the night, but the memory of that dark, rainy evening would stay with me for a long time. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was a dreary, rain-slicked evening when I found myself alone in my house for the first time in years. My parents had gone on a weekend trip to visit my aunt, and my younger brother was at a sleepover with his best friend. I had initially been excited about the idea of having the house all to myself, a break from my family's usual chaos. I had planned to binge watch horror movies, eat all the junk food I wanted, and stay up as late as I pleased. The rain had started early that afternoon, and by the time the evening rolled around, it had turned into a full-blown storm. Heavy droplets pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees surrounding our house. Our home wasn't in a completely isolated area, but it was far enough from the main road that on nights like this, it felt like we were the only people left in the world. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and turned on a few lights before settling on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. The glow of the TV flickered across the dimly lit living room as I scrolled through a list of movies, eventually settling on a classic slasher film. The irony of watching a horror movie while being home alone on a stormy night wasn't lost on me, but I had always been someone who enjoyed a little thrill. About 20 minutes into the movie, just as the masked killer was creeping toward his unsuspecting victim, a loud noise made me jump. It sounded like a thud, soft but deliberate. I muted the TV and listened, my heart pounding. The storm outside was relentless, but this noise had come from inside the house. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. Maybe something fell in the kitchen, or maybe the wind had knocked something over on the porch. But as I was about to resume my movie, another sound came, this time a faint scratching noise. It was coming from the back door. A shiver ran down my spine. My first thought was that an animal had gotten onto the porch, but the scratching was too deliberate, too slow. Gathering my courage, I got up and tiptoed to the kitchen, where the back door led to our enclosed porch. I flipped the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the darkened window of the door. I held my breath, straining my ears. For a few moments there was only the sound of rain and wind. Then suddenly, a loud bang against the door made me yelp. I stumbled backward, clutching my chest as my heart hammered wildly. Someone was out there. I fumbled for my phone and dialed my mom, my hands trembling. The call rang once before going straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I tried my dad. Same result. The power flickered then, and for a moment, the entire house was plunged into darkness. I stood frozen, barely breathing, until the lights flickered back on. My mind raced. Should I call the police? What would I even say? That I heard noises in the middle of a storm? Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to move toward the front door and double-check the lock. Everything was secure. Then, as I turned to head back to the living room, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just outside the window. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood turning to ice. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness and rain. It was standing eerily still, just outside the porch window, watching. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I slowly backed away, trying not to make any sudden movements. I needed to get out of there. Just as I turned toward the staircase, thinking I could hide in my room and call for help, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The porch door had been forced open. I ran. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked myself in my room and pushed my dresser against the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the slow, deliberate creak of floorboards. Someone was inside. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to determine where they were. The sound of footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside my door. Tears burned my eyes as I clutched my phone, my fingers fumbling to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to speak, but fear had stolen my voice. The footsteps started again, moving away from my door. I forced myself to whisper, someone's in my house. The operator's voice was calm and steady. Stay on the line. Are you in a safe place? I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. I'm in my room. The door is locked. Stay quiet. Help is on the way. Downstairs, I heard more noises. Shuffling, the creak of cabinets opening and closing. The intruder was searching for something. The operator kept talking, asking me questions to keep me calm. Minutes felt like hours. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. The house went eerily silent. Hello, I whispered. Stay where you are, the operator instructed. Then, just as I was about to respond, I heard it, the front door slamming shut. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. A few minutes later, red and blue lights flashed outside my window. The police arrived, knocking on the door and announcing themselves. When I finally unlocked my bedroom door and crept downstairs, my legs felt like jelly. The front door was wide open, rain pouring in. The officers searched the house but found no one. Whoever had been there was gone. But they had left something behind. Near the back door, muddy footprints trailed into the kitchen. The police noted that nothing had been stolen. No signs of forced entry other than the porch door. But as they swept the house, one officer found something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen table, where I had left my popcorn before fleeing upstairs, was a single wet handprint. Whoever had been in my house had been watching me the entire time. The police never found out who it was. There were no cameras, no real evidence. Just the footprints, the handprint, and my terrified account of what had happened. That was the last night I ever stayed home alone. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The rain poured down in thick sheets, drumming against the roof and windows with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The streetlights outside flickered, their weak glow barely piercing the darkness that swallowed the neighborhood. It was one of those nights. Cold, wet, and eerily quiet, the kind that made the world feel just a little too empty. I was home alone. It wasn't the first time. My parents often worked late, and my older brother had moved out 2 years ago. At 17, I was used to it, even welcomed the solitude most of the time. I had plans to watch a horror movie, maybe eat some leftover pizza, and just relax. The storm outside only added to the atmosphere. By 10 o'clock, I was curled up on the couch, my blanket wrapped around me like a cocoon, the soft glow of the television screen my only source of light. The horror movie I had picked was a slow burn, all tension and creeping dread, the kind of movie where the scariest thing was what you didn't see. And then I heard it. A soft knock. At first, I thought it was part of the movie, one of those perfectly timed sound effects designed to make you jump. But a second knock followed, and I realized with a chill that it had come from the front door. I froze. Who would be out in this storm? I wasn't expecting anyone. My parents would have called if they were coming home early. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I hesitated, glancing at my phone. No missed calls, no messages. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself it was probably a neighbor, maybe someone needing help. But deep down, I knew that wasn't likely. Not at this hour. Slowly, I stood up, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding louder than the rain. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. No one was there. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew I had heard knocking. I wasn't imagining it. Just as I was about to turn away, a flash of lightning illuminated the porch. For a split second, I saw something. A figure. Tall. Still. Standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced through possibilities. A trick of the light? Someone seeking shelter from the storm? Or something else? I locked the door. Double-checked it. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number. It rang and rang, but she didn't pick up. Another knock. Louder this time. I held my breath. Then came the worst part. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I darted into the kitchen. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find and backed into the corner, my pulse thundering in my ears. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Just the rain and the wind. Then, the back door creaked. My stomach dropped. The back door. I had locked it earlier. I was sure of it. But now, I wasn't so sure. I moved quietly through the house, careful to avoid any creaky spots on the floor. The kitchen window overlooked the backyard, and with the next flash of lightning, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The back door was slightly open, just a crack. I couldn't breathe. I had two options: call the police or hide. I chose both. I slipped into the pantry and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The line rang once, twice. A voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to speak, but my voice came out in a whisper. Someone is in my house. Stay calm, the operator said. Can you see them? No, I breathed, but the back door, a floorboard creaked outside the pantry. I clamped my hand over my mouth. Stay on the line, the operator said. Officers are on their way. I could hear my own heartbeat, hear the blood rushing in my ears. Another creak, closer this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tensed. Then, silence. For a long, unbearable moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, whoever it was had left. Then the pantry door handle turned. I almost screamed. The door didn't open, it was locked. But the handle jiggled again, and then a voice. Low, raspy. I know you're in there. I could have passed out from sheer terror. The voice was so close, just inches away from me. Then came a loud bang from the front of the house. A voice shouted, followed by more noise, footsteps, movement, chaos. Then silence. Minutes passed before I heard another voice, calmer, authoritative. This is the police. I barely had the strength to move. My body was frozen with fear. The officers found me in the pantry, still clutching my phone in my trembling hands. They told me they had found the back door forced open, muddy footprints trailing through the kitchen. Whoever had been in my house was gone. They never found him. There were no fingerprints, no real evidence, just the memory of that voice, those footsteps, the feeling of being watched. For weeks after, I barely slept. Every noise sent me into a panic. The rain, once soothing, now felt sinister. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I was not alone that night. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The storm had begun long before the sun had set, slowly creeping in from the west, blanketing the sky in thick clouds. By the time the night fell, it had become a full-on deluge. The sound of rain pounding against the windows was constant, and the occasional gust of wind caused the trees in the yard to sway and creak, their branches tapping against the house. It felt like the storm was trying to take over the world outside. I, however, was home alone, comfortably ensconced in my living room with a blanket wrapped around me and a mug of hot tea in my hands. My parents had gone to a late dinner with friends, and my older brother had left hours ago to stay at a friend's house. I was used to being alone, especially on nights like this, but there was always something different about being by yourself during a storm. The house felt more isolated, more vulnerable. I wasn't particularly scared, but something about the storm seemed to make everything seem off. The silence in the house was different, more pronounced, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but the glow from the screen only seemed to enhance the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The wind howled louder, and a flash of lightning lit up the sky, making everything in the room flicker. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 10:15 p.m. A little later than usual, but I wasn't feeling tired. The wind outside was picking up, now so fierce it rattled the windows, and the rain was coming down in sheets, splattering against the glass. As I sat there on the couch, scrolling through my phone, I suddenly heard something that made my heart skip a beat. A soft, distinct knock at the door. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the storm, but it was there. I froze, my finger hovering over the screen. My breath caught in my throat. Who would be knocking at the door in the middle of a storm at this hour? It didn't make sense. I slowly set my phone down and stood up, cautiously moving toward the door. The house was still, too still. I reached the door and hesitated, pressing my eye to the peephole, straining to see who was on the other side. There was no one there. My heart started to race as I turned the handle, pushing the door open just enough to peer outside. The porch was empty, drenched in rain. Nothing moved. The light from the porch flickered overhead, casting long shadows over the wet ground. I stepped back inside, locking the door again and pushing the deadbolt for good measure. Maybe it had just been the wind, I told myself. Maybe a branch had hit the door or something else caused the sound. But then, just as I was turning away, another knock came. Louder this time. My blood ran cold. I rushed to the window by the front door, careful not to make any noise. Peering through the blinds, I saw a figure standing under the porch light, half hidden in the shadows of the storm. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was tall, too tall to be a child, too bulky to be a person I recognized. My heart thudded in my chest. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Whoever was there wasn't leaving. I retreated quickly from the window, anger, my mind racing. Who could it be? Should I open the door? What if it was a neighbor? What if it wasn't? My thoughts collided with each other, and for a moment I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do. I grabbed my phone again, quickly typing a message to my mom, though I had a feeling she wouldn't see it in time. Someone is at the door. There was no reply. My fingers felt numb as I dialed her number. It rang and rang, but she didn't pick up. The anxiety bubbling up inside me made it hard to breathe. What should I do? Then came the sound that made my heart stop. The doorknob turning. It was quiet at first, just the faintest noise, but it was unmistakable. Whoever was outside was trying to open the door. I felt a wave of panic crash over me. My breath quickened, and I turned toward the kitchen, looking for something, anything, that I could use to protect myself. My eyes landed on a large butcher's knife sitting in the drying rack. It wasn't much, but it was something. I grabbed it, my hands shaking as I held it at my side, silently moving toward the hallway, away from the door. Another twist of the doorknob came, and then a sharp knock, like a fist pounding against the wood. At that moment, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving away from the door. I stood perfectly still, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something wasn't right. The footsteps stopped, and then came the worst sound. A creak. It came from the back of the house, the back door, which led to the kitchen. The sound was faint but distinct, and I recognized it immediately. The back door wasn't locked. I was sure of it. I had to make a decision fast. Should I call the police? Should I run? Was someone really in the house, or was I just losing my mind? I didn't have time to second-guess myself. I ran down the hallway and into the kitchen, my heart thundering in my chest. The back door was slightly ajar, just enough to make my stomach turn. I approached it slowly, cautiously, keeping the knife in front of me like it would somehow offer protection. The wind whistled through the crack in the door, making the entire house feel colder. I grabbed the door handle and pushed, but it didn't open all the way. It was caught on something. I pressed harder, shoving it open with my shoulder. And then, just as I did, a figure stepped into the doorway. I barely had time to react before the figure was on me. A tall man, drenched from the rain, his face hidden under a hood. He lunged at me, but I managed to step back just in time, raising the knife in front of me like I had seen in movies. "Stay back!" I screamed, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. For a moment, the man just stood there, as if sizing me up. Then, to my surprise, he took a step back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Listen," he said, his voice low and raspy, "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need your help." My mind raced. What was he saying? What did he mean? "Help," I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" "I'm just trying to get out of the rain," he said. "I thought I could find shelter here. I didn't mean to scare you." I didn't believe him. The fear in my chest hadn't eased. It had only grown. Something wasn't right. Without warning, I turned and bolted for the front door, the knife still in my hand. I had to get out of the house. As I reached the door, I glanced back to see the man still standing in the kitchen, watching me. He didn't move, but there was something in his posture, something that told me he wasn't planning to leave just yet. I reached the front door and yanked it open. I didn't wait for the storm to knock me back. I ran out into the rain. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house, knocking frantically on their door, begging them to let me in. The police arrived soon after, but by then the man had vanished. They couldn't find him, no fingerprints, no evidence, nothing that pointed to who he was or why he had come to my house. But I knew what I felt that night, and I knew what I saw, and I would never be home alone during a storm again. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It had been one of those nights where the weather seemed to match the unsettling feeling that had crept up on me. The rain started early, a soft drizzle at first, which turned into a torrential downpour by the time evening rolled around. The wind had joined in too, rattling the trees and causing the branches to scrape against the side of the house. There was no thunder, no dramatic flashes of lightning, but the storm was relentless, hammering the windows with an almost mournful rhythm. I was home alone, which wasn't unusual for a Friday night. My parents had gone away for the weekend, visiting relatives out of town, and I had the house to myself. My older brother, Ben, had moved out months ago, and I was the only one left. It was nice sometimes, the solitude. I could stay up as late as I wanted, watch whatever I wanted on TV, and make myself a huge bowl of popcorn without anyone complaining. But tonight was different. The storm was far more intense than I had expected, and the isolation of being alone in the house felt heavier than usual. I had tried to distract myself with some online videos, but I couldn't focus. The wind howled outside, and the sound of rain hitting the roof felt oddly oppressive. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something move in the dark. I chalked it up to the storm playing tricks on me, but the unease remained. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic patter of rain. The occasional creak of the wooden floors under my feet was the only other sound. I stood up and went into the kitchen to get a snack. As I passed the front door, I paused for a moment. The deadbolt was locked, but the door itself was slightly ajar. That was odd. I always made sure to check that the door was securely locked when I was home alone. Had I forgotten? I couldn't be sure, but the nagging feeling that something was off returned. I shut the door with a soft click, double-checking the lock this time, before heading to the kitchen. The wind continued to batter the house, and the rain intensified, making the outside world seem distant and muffled. I grabbed a bag of chips and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone. A glance at the clock told me it was already past midnight. The house was dark except for the soft glow from the kitchen light, and for a moment I allowed myself to enjoy the peace of being alone, even if it was a little eerie. I was just about to head back to the living room when I heard it. A knock, soft at first, almost like a tap. It came from the back door, the one that led to the small backyard. I froze, my heart rate quickening as I stared toward the door. The wind outside could make strange noises, but this sounded like someone was knocking. I told myself it was just the storm. Maybe the wind had pushed something against the door, or maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I stood still, waiting, but there was no more sound. The knock hadn't come again, but now I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I went over to the back door and peered through the small window in it. The yard was barely visible through the heavy rain, and the dark shapes of the trees were swaying in the wind. There was no one there. I sighed in relief, brushing off the tension in my chest. It had to be the wind or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I locked the back door and made sure all the other windows were secure. I then grabbed my phone, unlocking it and texting my mom, just to check in. "Everything good?" I typed. The reply came almost instantly. "Everything's fine. Just checking in. You good?" I smiled at her response. My parents didn't typically text this late, but I figured they just wanted to make sure I was okay, especially with the storm. "I'm fine. It's just the weather freaking me out. It's getting really bad out there." I sent the message and set my phone down on the counter, trying to focus on anything other than the creeping feeling that was starting to take over. I spent the next hour on the couch, watching a TV show I'd seen 100 times before, just to distract myself. But the rain kept pouring, the wind howling, and I couldn't shake the constant sensation that something wasn't right. The house creaked and groaned, and I kept hearing sounds that seemed just slightly out of place. Something shifting, a soft movement, a knock that could have been the wind. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, but the tension kept building. Around 1:45 a.m., I decided to head to bed. The storm had taken a bit of a break, and the silence seemed almost worse now. As I passed through the living room, I froze. There on the coffee table was my phone. It was face up, the screen cracked, and the battery was almost dead. I picked it up, confused. I hadn't left it there. I had set it down on the kitchen counter when I was making my snack. The screen flickered as I touched it, and I checked the notifications. There was one new message, but it wasn't from my mom. It was from an unknown number. Let me in. I felt my stomach drop. The message was short, simple, and chilling. My hands shook as I stared at the text. Who would have sent this and why? I quickly opened my texts, scanning through them to make sure no one else had tried to contact me, but there was nothing. I checked the call log too, but there were no missed calls, no calls at all. My pulse quickened. I looked at the door again, the one I had locked not too long ago. For a brief moment, I considered calling the police, but then I stopped. I didn't have any concrete proof that anything was wrong. The message could have been a prank or just some random spam. Still, my mind raced. Was I just being paranoid? Was I overreacting? I grabbed my phone, trying to calm myself, and walked toward the stairs. As I stepped onto the bottom step, I heard it again. A sound, soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. A knock. This time, it was coming from the front door. I froze. This wasn't just the wind. This was someone actively knocking at my door. My breath hitched in my throat. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, listening as the knocks continued. Slow, steady, deliberate. I took a step back toward the living room, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. Should I call 911? But what would I even tell them? There was no obvious danger yet. No sign of forced entry. It could just be someone messing around. I stood in the dark, trying to quiet my thoughts. I was too scared to move, but I knew I couldn't just stay here. I had to make a decision. Then, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't stay still anymore. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and quietly made my way to the front door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing, just the rain, pouring down in sheets, and the darkened yard. No one was standing there. Confused and terrified, I opened the door a crack, just enough to see outside. The porch light flickered once and then went out. I stood there, my heart racing, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow moved in the darkness, shifting quickly across the yard. I slammed the door shut, bolting it with shaking hands. Panic rose in my chest as I tried to calm myself. There was someone out there. They were watching me. I backed away from the door slowly, as if any sudden movement might make things worse. I felt trapped, helpless, as the storm continued to rage outside. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I just wanted my parents back. I wanted someone to tell me that everything was okay. The storm outside grew louder, but the silence inside was overwhelming. I went to the window, heart pounding in my chest, and pulled back the curtain just a fraction to peek outside. Nothing. The yard was empty, the shadow was gone. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was a cold and dark evening in November when Sarah found herself alone at home, her parents having left for a weekend getaway in the city. She was 17, mature for her age, and had spent many weekends alone in the past, but tonight was different. The rain was relentless, tapping against the windows with a steady rhythm that made the entire house feel like a distant, lonely island. The wind howled, pushing against the walls, making the old house creak in protest. It was the kind of night that made the shadows longer and the silence heavier. The house, a 2-story Victorian-style building with old wooden floors and heavy oak furniture, was mostly quiet except for the sound of the rain. Sarah had settled on the couch with a book, the glow from the table lamp casting a warm yellow light over the room. The fireplace crackled gently, adding a comforting hum to the otherwise eerie atmosphere. She glanced at the clock. It was 8:30 p.m. Her parents had texted earlier saying they were caught in traffic and wouldn't be back until late. It didn't bother Sarah. She liked the solitude. Still, there was something unsettling about this night, something in the air that made her feel on edge. She couldn't quite place it, but it was as if the storm outside was a warning of something yet to come. She tried to shake off the feeling, turning her attention back to her book, but the unease lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't long before the first knock at the door interrupted her concentration. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the door or something falling from the trees outside. But the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a brief pause. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who could be out there in this weather? She rose from the couch, slowly, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She peered through the peephole in the front door, but all she could see was the dark shape of the porch, the rain pouring down in sheets. There was no one. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe someone had made a mistake. The thought didn't comfort her much. The knock came again, this time more urgent, as if whoever was out there knew she was inside and was waiting for her to answer. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if it was someone in need? A stranded driver or someone lost in the storm. But then again, it could be a prankster, or worse, someone with ill intentions. Taking a deep breath, she decided to call her parents. She needed to hear their voice, to feel a little less alone in this moment. Her phone buzzed to life in her hand, but just as she was about to dial, the doorbell rang. It was sharp, its tone cutting through the silence like a knife. Sarah flinched. She took a step back, her mind racing. Who could it be? Her parents were supposed to be on their way back soon, but they wouldn't be here for another hour at least. And this person, whoever they were, wasn't leaving. Feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her, she reluctantly walked to the window next to the door. She peeked through the curtains, trying to make out any figures in the rain, but all she could see was the shadowy outline of the porch. The streetlights flickered in the distance, and the storm was intensifying. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her dad. "Sorry, traffic's bad. We'll be late, but we're fine. Stay safe." It was then that Sarah heard it again. The knock. This time more frantic, followed by a voice. "Hey, please, I need help." The voice was low and strained, and it sent a chill down her spine. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. What if someone really needed help? She couldn't ignore that, but there was also the nagging fear in the back of her mind that something wasn't right. She took a deep breath and cautiously approached the door again, this time picking up her phone and dialing the police. As she hit the call button, she heard the voice outside again. "Please, my car broke down. I don't know where I am, but I need help." The voice was frantic now, desperate. Sarah didn't know what to do. She hadn't called the police before, but this situation felt too strange. She hesitated, watching the door as the rain continued to lash against the windows. "Hello?" the voice asked. "Please, I'm not dangerous. I just need help." The dispatcher on the other end of the phone answered, her voice calm and professional. Sarah quickly explained the situation, her words coming out in a jumble of nerves. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way and advised her not to open the door, to stay inside and wait for the police. Sarah hung up the phone and stepped back from the door, her mind racing. The knocking had stopped, but she could still hear the faint sound of someone shifting outside. She glanced at the clock again. It was now nearly 9 p.m. What if the police took too long to get here? A loud bang suddenly echoed from the back of the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping against the window. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Was someone trying to break in? She rushed to the kitchen, grabbing the nearest thing she could find, a heavy cast-iron skillet, and held it tightly in her hands. Her mind was a whirl of fear and confusion as she moved silently through the house, trying to listen for any other sounds. Her footsteps were quiet, but the weight of the silence made every movement seem deafening. She made her way to the back door, peeking through the blinds. The rain was coming down harder than ever, and the backyard was barely visible through the sheets of water. But there, just at the edge of her vision, she saw something, a dark figure moving near the fence. Panic surged through her. What should she do? Should she hide? Should she run? Just as Sarah turned to make her way upstairs to her room, she heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Her heart stopped. She wasn't alone. The door at the back of the house, the one that led to the basement, was slowly swinging open. Sarah's body moved on its own, her legs carrying her toward the stairs without thought. Her pulse raced as she reached the top and ran down the hall to her bedroom. She locked the door behind her and crawled under the bed, clutching the skillet tightly. She needed to think. The minutes felt like hours as she lay still, barely breathing, waiting for any sound to indicate someone was in the house. The storm outside raged on, but inside all was deathly quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Suddenly she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming up the stairs. She held her breath, her grip tightening around the skillet. She didn't know how long it had been, but it felt like forever. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside her door. "Sarah," a voice called softly, almost tenderly. It was her mother's voice. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but something felt off. Her mother wasn't supposed to be back yet. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. The footsteps came closer to the door. Then they stopped. "Open the door, sweetie," the voice said, this time with an almost insistent tone. No, something was wrong. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to stay hidden. She waited. The house was eerily silent again. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps finally retreated. She could hear the faint sound of the door at the bottom of the stairs creaking again. It sounded like whoever had been there was leaving. Sarah's mind was reeling. She had no idea what was happening, but she wasn't going to take any chances. She slowly crawled out from under the bed and grabbed her phone once more. Her hands were shaking as she dialed the police again. This time, she was insistent. They needed to get here, fast. When they finally arrived, the house was quiet again. The police searched every room, but they found no sign of anyone. There were no forced entries, no broken windows, nothing that could explain what had just happened. But Sarah knew she had felt the presence of someone in the house. And as the officers left, she heard the faintest sound. Another knock on the door. Story the end.